When I first bought my house in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, I thought I had found my dream place. It was a two-story home with a wide porch, a backyard big enough for barbecues and gardening, and a peaceful lake just a few minutes walk away. The only catch was that the community was managed by a homeowners association, and while I had heard a few horror stories about HOAs, I figured it couldn't be that bad. After all, most of the neighbors seemed friendly when I moved in, waving as they walked their dogs or worked on their lawns. For the first few months, everything went smoothly, but then I met her, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She wasn't technically the president, but she had been on the board for years, and everyone knew she pulled the strings. Karen had that kind of energy where she believed she was entitled to run everything from what flowers you could plant to how tall your grass could be, and she thrived on intimidation. My first run-in with her came when I left my trash cans out a little longer than usual because of a late pickup. She stormed up to my porch, clipboard in hand, telling me that I was ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I brushed it off, thinking it was a one-time annoyance, but soon she was on my case about everything. My choice of paint color for the shutters, the small solar lights I'd placed along the driveway, even the hammock I had tied between two trees in the backyard that wasn't visible from the street. Each time, she threatened me with fines, quoting HOA bylaws like they were divine law, and though the amounts were usually small, it was the principle of the thing that made me grit my teeth. I wasn't the only one who felt targeted. Neighbors whispered about how Karen would pick her victims and hound them until they either gave in or moved out. But while everyone else seemed to bow down to her, I refused to be bullied, which seemed to make me her favorite target. Things escalated when I decided to install a small shed in the backyard for tools and equipment. I had checked the HOA guidelines, and everything I did was within the rules, correct size, neutral color, and placed out of sight from the street. But the moment Karen noticed it, she showed up with her ever-present clipboard, snapping pictures like a paparazzi, and claiming I hadn't filed the proper approval paperwork. I pointed out that the guidelines didn't require it since the shed was under a certain size, but she dismissed me with a smug grin and muttered, "We'll see what the board says." Weeks later, I received a notice in the mail, a fine for $50,000 citing structural violations, unapproved alterations, and repeated noncompliance with HOA regulations. I nearly dropped the paper when I saw the number. $50,000. It wasn't just outrageous, it was financially ruinous. The letter was signed by Karen herself, though technically it should have come from the board, and it gave me 30 days to pay or face a lien on my property. Furious, I marched over to Karen's house to demand an explanation, but she smirked at me from her porch, sipping iced tea like she had been waiting for this moment. "Rules are rules," she said in that sing-song tone, "and maybe next time you'll think twice about ignoring them." I told her there was no way I was paying, and she leaned closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You'll regret this. I always win." Shaken but determined not to back down, I called the HOA office to contest the fine, only to be told by the receptionist that all disputes had to go through the enforcement officer. That's when things took a turn for the surreal, because when I requested to meet the officer assigned to my case, I was told it was someone from the local code enforcement unit who worked closely with the HOA. A few days later, an officer in uniform showed up at my door, holding a file with my name on it. He looked tired, like he'd rather be anywhere else, but when I explained the absurdity of the situation, he sighed and said, "I'll be honest with you, Karen's my boss." I blinked, thinking I had misheard him, but he went on, "She's on the city's housing code committee. Technically, she has authority over me when it comes to HOA enforcement. If she says it's a violation, I'm supposed to write it up." My stomach dropped. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood tyrant. She had actual institutional power backing her up, which explained why she always acted untouchable. Still, something about the officer's tone told me he wasn't entirely happy about it. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, off the record, a lot of us think she's abusing her position. You're not the first homeowner she's tried to bankrupt. But on the record, my hands are tied." That was when I realized I wasn't just fighting Karen, I was fighting a whole system she had manipulated to give herself unchecked authority. After that shocking revelation from the officer, I knew I couldn't just sit back and let Karen steamroll me into paying a ridiculous $50,000 fine. The sheer audacity of it, the smug confidence in her face when she told me she always wins, it lit a fire in me. That night, I sat at my dining table with all the HOA paperwork I could dig up, newsletters, bylaws, meeting minutes I had stuffed into a drawer, and even the welcome packet they gave me when I moved in. I started combing through everything, line by line, looking for loopholes or inconsistencies. What I found was disturbing. Over the years, Karen had managed to amend sections of the bylaws with vague language that gave the board, and by extension herself, unlimited power to impose discretionary fines for ongoing noncompliance. The terms weren't defined clearly, which meant she could interpret them however she wanted. Even worse, I discovered that most of the board meetings weren't actually open to the community despite bylaws stating they had to be. Instead, Karen would send out one-page summaries claiming decisions had been made unanimously. The more I dug, the more it became clear that she had been running the HOA like her personal empire for years. But information alone wasn't enough. I needed allies. I started by reaching out to a few neighbors I had spoken to before, people who had grumbled about Karen's antics but never stood up to her. One of them was Mrs. Delgado, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down. She confided that Karen had fined her $5,000 last year for having a wheelchair ramp installed without aesthetic approval. Another neighbor, Tom, revealed that Karen had tried to block his backyard fence because it looked too working class. Slowly, I realized there was a pattern. Karen preyed on people she thought wouldn't fight back: seniors, single parents, new homeowners unfamiliar with the rules. I proposed we meet in private to discuss our grievances, so we gathered in my garage one evening, the air thick with frustration and resentment. There were nearly a dozen of us, and as each person shared their story, the room buzzed with outrage. It wasn't just about fines anymore, it was about years of bullying and intimidation. That's when I suggested forming an informal coalition to challenge Karen. We agreed to start by demanding transparency from the board, requesting access to financial records and meeting minutes, which by law we had the right to see. Predictably, Karen stonewalled us, sending back a snide email claiming we could only view records during business hours at the HOA office, which was conveniently open only when most of us were at work. But Tom, who worked remotely, volunteered to go. And when he did, he was shocked by what he found. The HOA's financial statements showed massive administrative expenses that didn't add up, including reimbursements to Karen for things like consulting fees, landscaping oversight, and even community wellness initiatives that no one had ever heard of. It looked like she had been siphoning HOA funds for her personal use. We now had something bigger than unfair fines. We had potential fraud. Encouraged, we decided to escalate. I drafted a formal petition demanding a special election to remove Karen and any board members complicit in her schemes. Under state law, if a certain percentage of homeowners signed, we could force a recall. Collecting signatures wasn't easy, though, because Karen's influence had spread fear. Some people were terrified of retaliation, fines, harassment, or even legal threats. Still, little by little, we gathered enough. Each time we explained what we had uncovered about Karen's misuse of funds, people were more willing to put their names down. One night, after we finally hit the required number of signatures, Karen herself showed up at my door livid. She must have gotten wind of our efforts because she didn't bother with her usual fake pleasantries. She jabbed her finger in my face, hissing that I was a troublemaker and that I was destroying the harmony of the community. I told her flat out that she was abusing her power and that people were tired of it. Her face turned red, and she spat out that if I thought I could beat her, I was mistaken because she had friends in high places. I assumed she meant her ties to the code enforcement office, but later I would learn it was deeper than that. The very next morning, I woke up to find a notice taped to my door, a violation for unapproved gatherings on my property, citing the meeting we had held in my garage. The fine? Another $10,000. It was laughable, but it also showed how desperate Karen was getting. I took the notice straight to the group, and instead of scaring them, it emboldened them. People were outraged at her blatant retaliation, and it only made our case stronger. At this point, I knew we couldn't just rely on HOA procedures alone. We needed outside help. I contacted a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, and when I showed him the evidence we'd gathered, the vague bylaw changes, the questionable financials, the retaliatory fines, he raised his eyebrows and said, "This isn't just mismanagement. This could be criminal." That was the turning point. With his guidance, we began preparing a formal complaint not only to the HOA Oversight Committee, but also to the State Attorney General's office. At the same time, we went public within the neighborhood, circulating flyers and emails explaining Karen's abuses and inviting people to a community-wide meeting at the local park away from HOA property so she couldn't interfere. On the day of the meeting, I expected maybe 20 or 30 people to show up, but instead, nearly half the neighborhood came. People were angry, sharing their own stories, many of which I had never heard before. Some had been fined for things as petty as leaving Christmas lights up a week too long or planting roses instead of tulips. The mood quickly shifted from frustration to determination. We weren't just fighting one woman, we were fighting for our homes, our rights, and our peace of mind. Karen must have heard about the gathering because halfway through, she showed up with a couple of board members, shouting that the meeting was unauthorized and threatening to call the police. But this time, instead of cowering, people shouted back. One elderly man told her she had made his retirement miserable. A young mother accused her of targeting her because her kids left toys in the yard. Karen's face twisted with rage, and she screamed that none of it mattered because the law is on my side. But for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes when dozens of people turned their backs on her, refusing to be silenced. It was in that moment I realized we had cracked her armor of invincibility. She still had power, yes, but she was no longer feared in the same way. And once fear is gone, control begins to slip. What none of us knew yet, however, was just how deep Karen's connections went and how far she would go to protect them. The weeks following that explosive community meeting were some of the most tense I had ever experienced, because while we had gained momentum, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Almost immediately after the park gathering, she began doubling down on her intimidation tactics, issuing a flurry of violation notices to anyone she recognized from the meeting. People were fined for things as absurd as excessive lawn watering, unsightly mailboxes, and improper vehicle parking when their cars were parked in their own driveways. It was her way of trying to send a message: defy me, and I'll make your life miserable. But the difference now was that people weren't silently paying the fines anymore. They were documenting them, taking pictures, and forwarding everything to the attorney we had retained. Each new bogus violation became another brick in the case we were building against her. Still, the most important piece of the puzzle was finding a way to expose her connections within city enforcement, because that's where her true power lay. Without those ties, she was just another overzealous HOA bully. With them, she had legal authority to back up her threats. That's where the officer who had once told me she's my boss came back into play. I hadn't forgotten the uneasy look in his eyes when he said it, and I decided to track him down. His name was Officer Blake, and after a few calls, I managed to catch him outside City Hall one afternoon. At first, he was reluctant to talk, citing professional boundaries, but when I explained the scale of what Karen was doing, the fraudulent fines, the embezzlement from HOA funds, the retaliation, he softened. He admitted he had been uncomfortable with her for a long time. He told me that Karen sat on a city advisory committee that technically had oversight of local code enforcement, which meant she had direct influence over his job and those of his colleagues. In practice, she used that influence to get them to rubber stamp her complaints or intimidate homeowners into compliance. "We all know she abuses the system," he said quietly, "but nobody wants to risk their career going against her. She has friends higher up than you think." That last part intrigued me, and I pressed him for details. He revealed that Karen's brother-in-law was a deputy city manager, and through him, she had cultivated a network of allies in the bureaucracy. That explained why complaints against her never went anywhere. But Blake also said he was tired of watching innocent people get crushed under her vendettas. "If you can guarantee I won't lose my badge, I'll give you what I know," he told me. It was a risk, but I promised him that with enough evidence, this would go beyond HOA politics and become a matter of public corruption. Slowly, he began providing me with documents, internal memos showing Karen pressuring officers to prioritize her complaints, email chains where she bypassed normal procedures, and even a record of an emergency inspection she had ordered on a neighbor's home just because they planted the wrong type of shrubs. This was the smoking gun we needed. Meanwhile, our attorney filed an injunction to halt Karen's attempt to collect on my $50,000 fine until the case could be reviewed in court. That bought me some breathing room. But it also seemed to make her even more desperate. She began showing up at my house unannounced, standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard like a hawk, scribbling notes and muttering under her breath about federal escalation. At one point, she even called animal control on me, claiming my dog was a danger to the community, even though Buddy was a 12-year-old golden retriever who could barely muster the energy to bark at the mailman. But every one of her stunts backfired, because instead of scaring people, they rallied more neighbors to our side. The neighborhood Facebook group, once dominated by her passive-aggressive posts about community standards, was now flooded with angry comments calling her out and demanding accountability. When we finally held the official recall vote, more than two-thirds of homeowners turned up, far surpassing the required quorum. Karen tried to block the vote, screaming that it was invalid, but the attorney overseeing it assured everyone that it was legally sound. When the ballots were counted and the results announced, the crowd erupted. Karen had been officially removed from the HOA board, along with two of her loyal allies. For the first time since I had moved into Willow Creek, I felt a sense of real victory. But as I would soon learn, removing her from the HOA board didn't strip her of her city connections, and that was where the real battle was about to begin. In the weeks that followed, Karen launched an appeal through her brother-in-law's office, claiming the recall had been procedurally flawed. She also filed a defamation lawsuit against me personally, accusing me of spreading lies to incite community unrest. It was laughable, but it forced me to spend even more time with lawyers preparing to defend myself. Fortunately, we now had Officer Blake's evidence, and when our attorney presented it to the judge overseeing the injunction, it raised serious questions about Karen's credibility. The judge ordered a temporary freeze on all HOA fines pending a deeper investigation, which meant dozens of neighbors suddenly had relief from Karen's bogus penalties. That would only seem to enrage her further. She began skulking around the neighborhood, glaring at anyone who dared make eye contact, as if sheer intimidation could undo what we had accomplished. Then one morning, the story broke in the local newspaper. HOA leader accused of abusing city ties for personal gain. Somehow, word of our complaint to the Attorney General had leaked, and a journalist had picked it up. The article detailed everything: the shady bylaw changes, the financial irregularities, and most damning of all, the documents Officer Blake had shared showing her manipulating city enforcement for her own ends. Reading it in black and white was surreal. And while part of me feared her retaliation, the larger part felt vindicated. For years, she had hidden behind a veneer of authority and self-righteousness, but now the mask was slipping for everyone to see. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with texts and emails from neighbors thanking me for standing up to her, some even apologizing for not getting involved sooner. The tide had truly turned. But Karen wasn't finished. That evening, she showed up outside my house again, this time without her clipboard. Her face was twisted with fury, and she shouted across the lawn that I had no idea who I was messing with. She warned me that her connections went all the way to the mayor's office, and that if I thought a little newspaper article could stop her, I was dead wrong. I didn't respond, just closed the blinds and let her rage into the night. But inside, I knew we were approaching the final showdown. The legal system was in motion, the community was united, and her empire of fear was crumbling. But people like Karen don't go quietly, they go down swinging, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed felt like living in the middle of a storm, with pressure building on all sides and no clear idea of when or how it would break. On one hand, we had momentum. The recall vote had stripped Karen of her official HOA throne, the injunction had frozen her fines, and the newspaper article had thrown a floodlight on her abuses. On the other hand, Karen was lashing out like a cornered animal, using every last shred of influence she had left. She filed appeals, threatened lawsuits, and even tried to rally a handful of loyal neighbors to defend her, though their numbers dwindled with each passing day as more evidence of her misconduct came to light. The Attorney General's office had officially opened an investigation into her misuse of HOA funds and her manipulation of city code enforcement, and they requested full cooperation from the community. That was the moment I realized we weren't just fighting for our neighborhood anymore. This had become a matter of public accountability, with stakes higher than I could have imagined when the first violation notice landed on my doorstep. The most critical piece, though, was testimony, and that's where Officer Blake stepped up in a way that surprised even me. Despite the risk to his career, he agreed to provide sworn testimony about Karen's pressure on code enforcement officers, her frequent demands for emergency inspections, and the chilling reality that she had treated city resources like her personal enforcement squad. When he walked into the hearing room for the first time, in full uniform, you could almost feel the collective gasp ripple through the room. Karen, seated across the table with her lawyer and her ever-present smirk, visibly stiffened when he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. And then he laid it all out: the memos, the emails, the direct orders she had issued under the guise of committee oversight. He didn't just tell stories, he produced receipts, hard evidence that tied her manipulations directly to financial harm for homeowners. Watching her face as he spoke was like watching a mask crack in real time. Her confident veneer slipped into barely contained panic. Her lawyer tried to object, tried to paint Blake as a disgruntled employee, but the documentation was undeniable. And then came the financial evidence, those shady administrative reimbursements Tom had uncovered from the HOA records. An independent auditor confirmed what we all suspected. Karen had diverted tens of thousands of dollars in HOA funds for personal use. Trips labeled as community wellness retreats were actually vacations. Landscaping fees were grossly inflated, with payments funneled to a company owned by her cousin. Even office supplies had been padded, with purchases that clearly went far beyond anything the HOA would ever need. One by one, the pillars of her empire crumbled before her eyes. But Karen wasn't the type to sit quietly and accept defeat. At one point during the hearing, she slammed her hand on the table and shouted that we were all liars, that this was a coordinated attack against her by malcontents who hated order. She claimed that without her, the neighborhood would collapse into chaos, that property values would plummet, that outsiders would move in and destroy everything. Her rant only dug her hole deeper, making her look less like a leader and more like a tyrant unhinged by the loss of power. When the panel overseeing the case adjourned, the writing was already on the wall. A few weeks later, the official ruling came down. Karen was permanently barred from serving on the HOA board, ordered to repay misappropriated funds, and referred to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges. The moment the news broke, the entire neighborhood erupted in celebration. People who had lived under her thumb for years gathered in driveways and front yards, toasting with beers and sodas, hugging each other, and marveling at how quickly the atmosphere had changed. Where there had once been fear, there was now relief and joy. Kids played in yards without parents worrying about toy fines. Neighbors hung holiday decorations proudly without wondering if they would be cited for non-compliant light displays. The transformation was almost immediate. As for me, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. The fight had consumed months of my life, but it had also bonded me with my neighbors in ways I never expected. We weren't just a collection of houses anymore. We were a community that had stood up to a bully and won. Officer Blake even stopped by my house one evening, not in uniform this time, but in jeans and a t-shirt, just to say thanks. He admitted he had been nervous about coming forward, but seeing the outcome reassured him that doing the right thing had been worth it. I shook his hand and told him he was the real hero in this story. Without his courage, Karen might still have been terrorizing us unchecked. Of course, Karen herself didn't disappear quietly. Rumors swirled that she had moved in with relatives after being forced to sell her house to pay back some of the stolen funds. A few people claimed they had seen her in town, scowling at passersby, but she never set foot in Willow Creek again. It was as if the neighborhood had exorcised a demon. In her absence, we held a new election for the HOA board, this time with real transparency. The new leadership included a mix of longtime residents and newer homeowners, and instead of using the bylaws as weapons, they focused on actual community improvements, fixing the broken swing set in the park, organizing block parties, even starting a neighborhood watch program that didn't involve Karen lurking with a clipboard. Life returned to normal, but it was better than normal. It was free. I often thought back to that day when Officer Blake first told me she's my boss and how hopeless it had made me feel. Back then, it seemed like Karen's grip on power was unbreakable, her connections too strong, her influence too wide. But standing there months later, watching kids run through sprinklers while parents laugh together on their lawns, I realized something important. No tyrant, no matter how entrenched, can withstand the will of a united community. The difference had never been about her power, it had always been about our willingness to resist it. And in the end, that's what saved Willow Creek. As for me, every time I sit on my porch and sip my coffee in peace, I can't help but smile, remembering the $50,000 fine that started it all. Karen had tried to break me with that outrageous threat, but instead, she had unwittingly lit the spark that set her entire empire on fire. In the end, she lost everything, and we gained something priceless: the knowledge that we didn't need a self-appointed queen to keep our neighborhood together. We could do it ourselves with fairness, transparency, and mutual respect. And that, I think, is the sweetest victory of all.